Welcome everyone to Breakout Room 3, Digital Tools to Improve Political Participations. Great that you chose this one. As we've heard, we're going to have two presentations, one from Dr. Ricky Dean and one from Susana Maya. And after that, we're going into the big discussion. There, it's really open and free. Just unmute yourself or raise your hand, but please be polite and wait until the last person to speak has finished. Yes, that's all from my side. Ricky, I hand over the floor to you, and yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to share the screen. Yeah, I'm an academic, so of course I prepared PowerPoint slides. Be betraying the profession if I didn't. Okay. So hopefully you can see the slide and not my notes. Yeah, so my name is Ricky Dean. Thanks, Josie, for inviting me and introducing me. And I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Democratic Innovations Research Unit at Goethe University Frankfurt, where we do lots of research on citizen participation. So I'm looking forward to talking to you today about the increasing role of digital technology in citizen participation initiatives. And I was asked to give an introductory overview of the landscape of this in 10 minutes, which is not a very easy task. So I'm going to try and provide basically a kind of conceptual structure that I thought might help inform our later discussion, which I hope we would then elaborate and develop kind of ideas around inclusiveness. So I'll focus on introducing 4 digital developments that I think are important for citizen participation, and then 4 ways of thinking about citizen participation, which I think are important for understanding how digital technology is deployed. It's perhaps worth saying at the outset as well that my research focuses more on the policy side than the politics side. So I research how citizens participate in government more than how they participate in party politics and elections. So that's the kind of perspective that I am as a default coming from, but there's obviously lots of overlap between the two. And I think Susana Maya will focus more on the political in her presentation. So hopefully there should be a good complementarity between the two. So first up, 4 developments in digital technology that have important implications for citizen participation. So the first thing I'm going to start with is governance platforms, as I think it's the most obviously relevant. And what I mean by governance platforms is basically any form of Web 2.0 site or civic application that's specifically designed to help citizens engage in politics and policymaking. So you may have encountered something like this, for instance, with your local government. These kind of governance platforms are increasingly prominent in local politics. So for example, Frankfurt, the city in which I live, has a website where I can go to report any local infrastructural problems, or where I can propose new ideas for the city that other residents can comment on and support, or where I can find out about other opportunities to participate in city governance. And there's now a huge array of different kinds of governance platforms which are used for a range of different purposes, and I'll get into that a little bit more later in the presentation. One very useful resource that I try to kind of aggregate across these, which I put on the screen, is the Civic Tech Field Guide, which has amassed more than 4,000 different types of tech for civic purposes. And I'm sure Susana Maya will also be providing more examples of this kind of technology. So second is social media platforms, which I separate from governance platforms because they're not specifically designed for politics or policymaking. But social media has become such an important part of our general communication infrastructure that it's increasingly becoming the default for how we engage in politics. So citizens increasingly communicate with politicians and government on social media, which I think has some important consequences for how participation operates. So if we consider, for instance, this form of communication pre-social media, then you likely have sent, for instance, a letter or an MP directly to your, a letter or email directly to your MP, which is both private and direct. So nobody would have seen that apart from the MP and their staff. Whereas now this kind of communication tends to be public so that anyone can see it. And this likely changes the nature of the communication, making it more performative. And social media also erodes the boundaries between different sort of styles of communication. So it potentially alters the tone of the way that we communicate with politicians as well. And in addition, though there's a tendency to kind of think about communication on social media as disintermediated, it's in fact mediated by Facebook, Twitter, etc., and their filtering algorithms. So we may want to ask some vital questions about what it means for these organizations to mediate the kind of link between citizens and politicians or public officials in a way that they didn't before. So the third digital development I want to talk about is data analytics, which may seem a bit of an odd one to focus on. So by data analytics, I mean governments' attempts to use algorithmic analysis on various forms of big data to inform their policy making in a wide range of areas, from criminal justice policy to allocation of social benefits. So this is becoming an increasingly important way that governments make decisions. And it's important for participation, partly because it's a potential threat. So you've all probably come across the idea that Google knows more about us than we know about ourselves. So if government can obtain all of the information it needs to know about us through analysis of the data traces that we leave behind through our kind of everyday online activities, then invitation to participate may dry up. So we tend to think about participation as an intentional act with a specific goal, whereas it's possible in the future that data analytics fosters a more kind of passive form of participation than what we're currently used to. And it's also possible that data analytics opens up new spaces for participation. So existing data analytics projects have been plagued with problems of both data quality and biased outputs from algorithms. You probably all come across some examples of this kind of biased algorithmic decision making. So citizen input into auditing data and the algorithms is likely to become increasingly important as well. And then the fourth digital development is sensor technology, by which I mean anything that can be used for capturing digital data at source and in real time. So sensor technology is, of course, an important contributing factor to the data analytics I just mentioned. It's often the source of the big data, but it's also increasingly used to facilitate forms of bottom-up participation. So sensors are important because they provide us with evidence on which we can base our claims. Of course, if you carry around a smartphone in your pocket, then you potentially have a sensor with you at all times. And these phones are increasingly being used, our camera phones in particular, by citizens to hold public officials to account for abuses of power. For example, we've seen that, of course, with the exposure of police violence. In addition, there's lots of examples of citizen science projects that use sensors to measure aspects of the environment, such as air quality, either to supplement government-produced data with more fine-grained detail, or to challenge official data when it's not trustworthy. It's been particularly important in China, for instance, where these measures are often falsified. Okay, so that's a quick overview of different important digital technologies. Now for a quick introduction to different modes of citizen participation. So in my opinion, if we want to really understand the relationship between technology and participation, then it's important to have a good understanding of different ideas of participation. A lot of the writing on technology and politics, in my opinion, is too deterministic. So it only focuses on the way that technology can shape participation or politics. But our ideas about participation also shape the way that we use digital technologies and which digital technologies get used. So I've argued previously that there are four primary modes of public participation in policy decision-making, and I'll just briefly take you through each one. So the first mode is knowledge transfer. So participation as knowledge transfer is about assuring a wide variety of expertise is considered in processes of collective problem solving and decision making. And from my perspective, this is the most common mode of participation when it comes to government-led digital participation initiatives. So digital technologies are adopted so that we as citizens can share our expertise with government and help them make better decisions that result in more effective policies. So it's much more about broadening whose knowledge is included rather than redistributing decision power. As I already mentioned, for example, the Frankfurt Council website has an option for me to notify them of problems with public infrastructure, like a broken traffic light or park bench that they don't know about. And this is probably the most rudimentary form of knowledge transfer. Another archetypal example is the challenge.gov platform, which I just highlighted on the screen, on which the US governmental departments post complex policy challenges and they invite members of the public to submit their ideas for how to solve these issues. The second form of participation is collective decision-making, which in contrast is exactly about transforming the decision-making process so that decision power is more widely shared. So as such, it resonates much more with a kind of participatory democratic worldview. So digital technologies here will be adopted when they can broaden who takes part in decision-making. I think the most widespread use of this kind of technology being used by governments at the moment is participatory budgeting platforms that have been adopted in a number of cities around the world. So high-profile examples include Madrid, Paris, and Reykjavik. And then there's the Decidim platform that was developed in Barcelona, which is also used for these kinds of collective decision-making. So this gives the citizens the possibility to decide how a part of the city budget is distributed by voting on a range of project proposals that have also been created bottom up by residents and civil society. So here there's actually a redistribution of the decision-making power. The third form is choice and voice, which is much more about using participation to secure your own preferences as an individual. So whereas knowledge transfer is about expressing what you know and can contribute to society, choice and voice is more about expressing what you want. So digital technologies contribute to this form of participation to the extent that they help people make choices, or they provide new avenues for people to express their preferences. We see this both in the political space and the policy space. So, for example, in the political space, we increasingly see the voting advice applications. Some of you may have done this before an election. So a recent one was the EU and I system before the 2019 European elections. So they basically help you choose which party best fits your policy preferences based on your responses to a battery of survey questions. So they're trying to help you make choices in a choice space. And then in the policy space, we see the growth of platforms that look much like a sort of TripAdvisor for public services. So for example, in England, patients can give their doctor's practice a star rating that potential new patients can view before deciding whether to join up. So we're drawn kind of into these kind of forms of consumer rating in relation to public services. And then the final mode of participation is judgment and oversight, which is about upholding customary norms and intervening to punish transgressors. So digital technology can contribute to judgment and oversight when it enables citizens to engage in practices of monitoring and exposure of any violations of community standards. And there's been a lot of debate about the way that government can use digital technology to monitor us, but not so much about how we can use it to monitor power. But I think this mode of participation is actually the one that's most supported by the 4 digital developments that I mentioned. A nice example of this is the anti-corruption platforms that enable citizens to report when they were asked to pay a bribe to public officials. So the ability to report anonymously online has really been key to the success of these kinds of platforms. So that's a really whistle-stop tour through a range of different approaches to participation. Because of a lack of time, I really here focused with the 4 examples on forms of governance platform, partly because of that lack of time, and also because I wanted to show how very similar technology can be used to pursue quite different forms of participation. And this is related to kind of the ideas of participation that we have. But of course, the other digital developments that I mentioned can interact with these different modes of participation. I already talked, for example, about the way that camera phones combined with social media are enabling bottom-up oversight of police violence, for example. But I think I'm out of time, also a little bit over time, so I should leave it there and pass over to Susana and Maya. And then I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion, where I hope we can use some of these ideas maybe to more fully connect them to this question of inclusion. Whether that's further in elaborating the categories that I've spoken about or pointing out what's missing. So yeah, I will stop sharing and hand over to Susana.
Yes, thank you. Let me just share my screen as well for the brief introduction. Just a sec. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
So basically, I've brought a use case that we can use as a basis for the discussion. I founded VoteRookie 1 year ago because I realized that most GovTech or civic tech solutions are, from a tech perspective, really great, but from a user experience point of view, they have a lot of issues because, first of all, many applications, but also governmental offers are usually complex, or they don't reach a large group of people, especially underrepresented people like young people, for example, but also people who are not necessarily involved in politics yet. And the idea of Votroki is to bring tools, but also a more community-based feeling to civic participation through using digital tools. And what we did was we were analyzing a lot of different statistics, but also looking directly to work in pilot projects with young people. And this problem has been especially that young Europeans are not active in politics. So here you can see the voter representation amongst the different age groups. And for example, here in Germany, you can see that especially people under 21, but also under 25 have the lowest voter turnout when it comes to elections. And another problem that we found out is that especially young people, but also other groups like, for example, females, who, for example, in Germany, I think only 9% of German mayors are women, for example. So mostly, mayors in Germany are male. And if you look, for example, where I come from in Austria, it's even worse. But the question is why these groups are not taking part. And I think it's a great thing that we just saw before, that there are so many civic tech projects and platforms, but underrepresented people are still not getting active. So there's still a missing point. And we can also see that there are lots of young people here with an example in Germany, but if you look at the different countries, it can be similar in Europe. They are engaging in politics, like we saw. They are active on social media, they're posting things, they're going on the streets, maybe for Fridays for Future. So what we realized was, or what we asked ourselves was, that if this activism is actually clicktivism, is it just, to kind of maintain your social media profile and just add it to your kind of style of life, or is this really causing actual change, political change? And another big problem, of course, what you can see now, probably in I think 19 days, we have the biggest German elections in 16 years, is that the AfD party is getting more and more votes, especially also amongst young people. So this is just a small overview of our solution, that we built a digital prototype that we tested for 10 months with youth parliaments in Germany, but also with underrepresented youth and youth who are not active in politics yet. And we figured out that what you need is not only this gamification approach that we are working on, but you also need to do more interactive workshops, and also workshops through digital tools that young people can have fun in, because currently traditional political education is very boring. It's only about how can you cast your vote. And the last component that we found is that this community building element, as well as actually helping future voters work on societal challenges in a more active way than just, looking at polarizing content, looking at everything, that kind of politics is already displaying. We found an approach that mixing our app together with workshops in schools, but also workshops with organization, workshops bringing together stakeholders online, is really effective, especially if you want to reach youth or underrepresented people, for example, in rural areas. We had the unique opportunity that through digital ways, not only inside of the app, but also through the complementary education, we can reach new groups and help them get better access to politics. So this is just a small preview of the application. The application is still changing, but we are just about to launch our private beta version that we developed together in a pilot project with a youth parliament, where we have part of the application is how you can organize yourself better around elections, but also how you can continuously be updated about processes that are going on. One specific example is, for example, in Berlin, there's also a website, it's called meinberlin.de. And by law, we have to use this platform for civic participation. But The big problem is that, for example, the last civic participation cycle that we had on this platform, we had a 40 pages document that not even I was able to understand, even though I come from this area. And then youth or underrepresented people or people who don't speak German or people who live here since 20 years don't even know how to answer like a 40 pages strategic document. So we are speaking with meinberlin.de as well. How can Vote Rookie help give access actually to these kind of service in a more simple way? And what we developed is something called a civic activity radar and our vote radar. So in the civic activity radar, you get really small civic activities you can do. And the more that you engage in the platform, the more points you can get. So for example, if you cast a vote, if you run for office, you can get points. And then when you get these points, you can redeem them for actually towards a social impact project, for example. So you can see here, this says, thank you for your anonymous vote. And the whole platform idea is based on an avatar. So you get your own avatar that you choose in the beginning, and then you can get points for being engaged. So this is for a vote where you can get points, but we're also speaking with pilot partners. So for example, if you help during the election as a voting helper, you can get points. But also if you're, for example, helping in a sustainability project, you can earn points. And what we did is that we're speaking with organizations, also the EU Parliament, and then the EU Parliament can actually add these activities themselves on the platform. And there are different feedbacks, especially on the gamification aspect. Of course, that the question is, okay, if you put too much gamification, everyone will just take part in order to earn points and not because you want to be active. But we are doing this in workshops with schools and also the youth parliaments that we work with. And because we have this complementary political education course that really helps you get access to politics, it's actually really motivating, and the youth parliaments voted for the use of the app. I think one big difference is also that right now we have an actual, like right now it's a web app, but it will be a native app. So it's not just a desktop version, so it's fully mobile as well. And we're also working with the university in southern Germany to introduce also secure online voting into the platform. But it's already linked to the gamification, and you can in the future run also an online election through the app. So we are starting with the gamification and e-learning aspect, but we will turn it also in an online voting opportunity. Maybe just a quick run through on this. Of course, we support the SDGs. We also support in helping people to get access to the SDGs. In some surveys there, we can see that only 1 in 10 Europeans actually knows what the SDGs is. This happens frequently to us because we also live in this kind of civic tech social impact bubble. So the citizens we are working with, a lot of them aren't even aware of the SDGs. So it's our main focus that we want to promote them as well. And the other part is the ambassador program that I was already mentioning. So we are actually bringing this to another more institutionalized focus, because we want to help in Germany to build new youth parliaments using our app, but also our program. So we plan to collaborate here in Berlin, for example, with a new academy that helps to build youth parliaments. But we also want to focus on solving societal challenges in this program. So if any one of you is interested, you can join our nonprofit. You can become a volunteer and mentor and lead an actual working group working together with underrepresented youth. And the other part, maybe just a small overview of our team. We have 2 organizations that we just founded. One is the Vote Rookie Tech Company, which focuses on the digital development. And we also have founded a nonprofit that helps to use digital tools to promote democracy. And we are a really international team as well. As I said before, like I'm Austrian and I still cannot vote in Germany, even though I'm super active. I can only vote on a really local level. And our other team is also from Georgia, from United Kingdom. We also have our team based in Nigeria. So we believe that in a global way, you can also make a lot of change. And this is why the digital technology helps us a lot to do that. And here you can see an overview of our partners. We work closely together with different think tanks that work with underrepresented people. We also received the Berlin Startup Scholarship last year to build our prototype. And this year we were awarded by Amazon and the German Stifterverband as one of 12 digital projects in Germany that are working on improving edtech and political education. And we are also in collaboration talks with anyone who is working in civic participation, because we don't want to build another platform on top of all the existing platforms, but we want to help create awareness for the platforms, for surveys, for initiatives of governments. So we partner closely now, or we'll start to partner with the Berlin Senate, but we are also in talks with the European Parliament to see how can we promote each other's initiatives. And that becomes really transparent. Just one example from mein-Berlin.de. So they have around, I don't know, 20,000 registered users, or like it's a really, really low number if you look at the people living in actually Berlin. And also there are some statistics that show that even, I don't know if it's that number, but it's like around 1 million people in Berlin that can't even vote in the big election. So we are also a progressive movement in general to use digital technology to change this old school ways. And Germany has a lot of catching up to do. If you look at other regions that are already digital, here everything is still traditional. But I hope this use case gives a good overview. And maybe one last part about is we're really talking with the users. So this is something really important. Whatever app or digital technology you make in GovTech, usually the end user is not considered. So it's really important to always have them working together with you and iterate the product. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also, Ricky, thank you for your presentation. Ricky, do you want to start and lead the discussion as the academic expert?
Well, I guess first off, I'll ask if anyone has any questions that they want to raise on the presentations, whether anything was unclear or anything you disagreed with, or any comments that you wanted to make.
I had a question. First of all, I would like to thank the organization and the speakers. It was a very interesting webinar. But my question is for Susana. So I was curious about these digital youth parliaments. Maybe you've explained it and that I missed it. But I was wondering how these digital youth parliaments function. What kind of process or procedure do they follow, and what is the output of these parliaments? Do they have like a report full of recommendations, and how do they come to these recommendations in practice?
So I don't know if it's the term is basically something that we use in the project. So I don't know if it's maybe a bit confusing, or it basically what we want to do is leverage digital tools to actually build or initiate youth parliaments through digital technology, because currently there's a lot of politicians against youth parliaments. So in Germany, I think we have around 500 more or less, but we have different regions, where in one area you have a youth parliament since 20 years, but then you have one where there's a youth parliament since half a year, and they don't have any knowledge transfer between them. So we want to use the app. So some functionalities in the app will help you initiate the youth parliament through digital tools, but also to run for candidate through digital means. So with that, we hope that they will be initiated more, because we might reach more people as well, and also educate them through the app. So There are also some youth parliaments programs that are starting, but not necessarily as e-learning programs. So we kind of want to bring that together, and we call it digital youth parliament, but we mean like digitizing youth parliaments and help from that, help initiate them as well or improve them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so Frank also has a question.
Yes, I'm curious to know about financing. Susana, how is your tool financed? And another point to you, Ricky, also regarding financing, you mentioned social media as increasingly important platforms. To what extent are politicians paid to work through social media, and how is the financing there going on?
Susana, do you want to take that first?
Yes, sure. So last year we were financed by the Berlin Senate and the European Social Fund in an official startup program that promotes new digital startups. And this year we were financed through a prize that we won. As well as we are bootstrapping this project, and we are also aiming to finance it through pilot projects with municipalities, but it's not that simple because municipalities are always short of money, or during Corona it's difficult, but there's a big interest in pilot projects, so we hope to finance it like this.
And just a short follow-up, you mentioned points. Do you think of points that people can get through the platform as sort of an extra motivation, or do you have the vision that these points will be actually a payment for working on the platform?
Yes, exactly. So we also due to our collaboration with the university, we are also looking at blockchain and other possibilities, but this is really the future vision, to really kind of have a new point system for that. But for now, we call them karma points, and it's basically giving you something back. And then we want to redeem these points to real life projects, so real life nature conservation projects, real life, if there's an emergency like the flooding we had, for example, to get actual contribution towards social impact. And we discussed this also with the citizens, that because there are already platforms where you can get vouchers, for example, but we specifically wanted to improve something in your community. And then at the end, the municipality can see the actual impact they made, so you can have an overview how many points have been redeemed toward a certain project or SDG.
Yeah, so I'll quickly reflect on this question of financing in relation to social media companies. I mean, there's a question of a range of different incentives here, right? So we've got the kind of incentives of the politicians, who I think are really only doing this for an electoral incentive, right? Like there's an idea that kind of having a presence on social media is useful in order to get you elected. But so I think this is not so problematic, because it's kind of aligned with the incentives we expect of political action from politicians anyway. The financial incentive of the social media companies, of course, is much more problematic, I think, in this situation. So, I mean, the way that social media companies finance themselves is through this kind of attention economy, right? And so we know that this is not really kind of adapted towards productive democratic discussion. It kind of amplifies sort of forms of moral outrage and so on, and maybe unproductive forms of interaction with one another. And it's kind of interesting to see how this would affect the interactions between citizens and politicians on social media. So I think there's kind of the key question, right, is like, do we really want private companies who are essentially whose incentives are determined by profit making, to sit between and mediate the relationship between citizens and politicians or public officials? Probably, I would argue not, but this is the kind of world that we live in now. It's kind of a Wild West situation at the moment, I think, because at the same sense, whilst politicians are using these platforms, their behavior on them is completely unregulated. So it's absolutely fine for my politician, for instance, to block me if they don't want to hear from me or don't want me to see what they're saying. I mean, this is obviously extremely problematic from a democratic perspective, but we don't regulate this in any way. So the kind of role of social media companies, I think, in this intermediation role between politicians and citizens is extremely problematic, both from the financial perspective and from the fact that it's just a kind of unregulated Wild West at the moment.
I also, if I could add to this part, there was recently in May an initiative by Algorithm Watch, and they wanted to understand more about Facebook's Instagram algorithm, and they managed to prohibit that the algorithm gets actually explored. And this is a question also of transparency, and in civic participation, in civic tech, the question is how much transparency you have to give. I mean, in Germany, there are also always initiatives for more transparency also amongst politicians, but the question is also if you have algorithms or AI, or you're using political clustering, for example, it can get into a very scary way, and also then kind of having another bubble of fake news. So it can be just, yeah. And then if you have initiatives like this who are trying to explore an algorithm and they are prohibited to do that, just, I don't know, I would like to hear also your feedbacks, because the question is how much transparency do they have to give?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that this is also extremely problematic. If we're thinking about the way that these algorithms are sort of public infrastructure directing attention of politicians to certain discourses and not others, then the way that algorithm functions and whether it functions in order to produce a kind of healthy, productive public sphere is obviously extremely important. But at the moment, because these just private companies with no requirements to be transparent with their algorithm, and their algorithm is often the way, right, that like this is their secret source, so that they want to guard at all costs, and so they're very reluctant to kind of give people access to exploring this thing, I think. Dara, you have a question?
Yeah, it's maybe a bit more technical, but I guess also related to you know, this issue of transparency, and of course, like, you know, these industries, yeah, they want to keep their secrets, and let me just put down my hand here. Well, I was wondering, in Susana, you mentioned this blockchain procedure, and I was wondering how two things, like how you verify on the one hand that like something was done, you know, like an initiative was completed, or a sustainable purchase was made, or some such, and then secondly, that it was an impactful project, or that was completed. Like, is there an impact assessment or some such? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So we are just starting a working group on this, and we want to test it with our pilot partners. So in this case, we are hoping to get as many pilot partners as possible to actually test this, and also to check if somebody really has done this activity or not. But in the beginning, we wanted to start with closed, like, members group. Like, you can have an open members group and a closed one, but we wanted to start in a small closed environment and then see if we can open it up. In Germany, I forgot about the name, but there's also a bicycle project in Germany where people were also like relying on trust for having done certain things. So we will have to find a good way between, you know, the personal element, but also the tech sort of implementation. And that's why we collaborate with universities to have a project over several years to test this.
I hope that answers your question, Derek. Oh, perfect. Just to cut in here, I have some questions in the chat, and I'm looking at the chat. So there's 2 questions from Frank asking, do I understand you correctly that you argue for 100% transparency, Susana? And also a question to Ricky, in which quadrant in your model would you place Ricky?
I was actually going to pose that question to Susana. So in terms of, I wondered if it's helpful thinking about what you're doing in terms, like the 4 modes of participation that I talked about. Do you see yourself as working in one particular one of them, or across them, or doing actually something quite different which doesn't really fit in that model?
Yes, I'm also not 100% sure. So first on the transparency question, I'm like a tech person, but I'm also a activist. So I don't know what is better, because, you know, if it's 100% transparency, you know, sometimes it's also too much. I don't know. And also, for example, I mean, in our case, we were lucky that actually a corporate, I mean, the Amazon and Stifterverband program, Stifterverband is working with nonprofits. So it's not, we are not directly funded from Amazon, but from a social impact program. But in our case also, we had the plus point that a corporate company is helping us, and because if we would have just relied on public sector, it wouldn't work as well. So the corporate political responsibility aspect is also there. So I don't think there will be 100% transparency, but for example, there has to be more. There has to be a certain point, especially if we go into this open data, open citizen science, you know, then we need more.
On the second question, you were sort of just unsure as to where it sits.
Yeah, maybe. What would you say?
Well, I wasn't wholly sure either, actually, because it seemed that you were doing a range of different things. And one of the key things seemed to be information provision, which is not really something that I talked about, right? Because I talked about information provision in the terms of making choices. So maybe in some sense you're doing that, but it was more kind of information provision in terms of thinking about what opportunities there are to participate. And then, I mean, one of the questions I had for you actually was because you were talking about that people were voting on things on the platform, but or on the app, but I wasn't exactly sure what they were voting on. So that would kind of be interesting to hear a bit more about, because you said through the app you can kind of organize various forms of decision making and voting. So it'd be interesting to hear like what sort of examples of things people have voted on.
Yeah, so we have with the youth parliaments, but also municipalities, they will be voting online for candidates, like for mayors or for youth mayors. So the candidates can run for office on the app. So the users can directly vote for them on the app. But then during like times where there are no elections, they can be actively involved. So the idea is that they remain involved and not only give a vote, but they also actually, you know, become involved in different initiatives.
Okay. Marius, you have a question?
Yes. So I just wanted to extend on the question from you, Derek. So I would like to know how you measure like impact that is done through your application in direct democracy. So how do you define the impact there?
Yeah, so we've created different levels of impact depending on the like the weight of the sort of election or the time you invest. So for example, if you become a volunteer to help during an election for several weeks, we measure it like this. But to actually see the impact on the other side, this we cannot know yet because we haven't started the active projects. So this is something that we want to do together with researchers and collaborations.
Okay, thank you.
There is one more question in the chat, also from Frank. It also goes to Susana. In which concrete situations is total transparency not helpful?
Mm.
When there's police involved, right? You're doing a direct action or something that is maybe, potentially illegitimate, or, there's plenty of times when you don't want to be totally transparent, or you could shoot yourself in the foot, I can imagine,
Yeah, transparency, you probably have to have transparency when you wield power, right? Like if you're an authoritative body that wields power in some way, then it should be transparently wielded. But when you're a kind of counter-public that's strategically organizing an intervention, then it seems more legitimate that you would not be transparent about that strategic organizing. Or if you're kind of like a marginalized group who are excluded from the main sort of public sphere, then it seems that it's useful for you to have some kind of counter public space in which you can articulate your concerns in a safe space that's not wholly transparent to the whole world, so that you can then engage with the public sphere with kind of confidence in an articulated position rather than being overwhelmed before you get anywhere. So I think for me, transparency comes with the wielding of power, and when you are a counter-public which is not really wielding any particular power, mainly protecting from power, then there's not such a need to be transparent. That's how I would kind of look at it. So yeah, so one of the things that Susana's presentation raised for me around this kind of question of inclusion, which I think is quite interesting, because Susana was talking partly about the fact that she can't vote in Germany, which is also true for me. You may be able to tell from my accent that I'm not a German. And since Brexit, I can't even vote on the local issues or the European level anymore either. And so this is a kind of live question for me, and it's quite interesting that a lot of these platforms and civic participation initiatives are much more inclusive in that respect, right? It's not only citizens who can participate, it's often, if it's a local initiative, it's all residents. And so I think this is one way in which actually these civic applications are extending our kind of idea of citizenship in a way, to extend it beyond the kind of formalized idea of citizenship that we have. And then the other thing that I was kind of interested in from the inclusion perspective, Susana, is because you were talking about how you were working with people in youth parliaments who I imagine are kind of super political young people, right? Like these are the people who are potentially going to run for office in the future and so on. And then you also were trying to reach out to groups of students who are not really political and not really involved. And I wondered if you had a look at the ways that they use your technology, and if there's big differences between these kinds of people who are already highly political and the ones who are sort of maybe starting to think about politics for the first time through use of this technology.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And for example, in the pilot project where I'm involved, also most of the participants were male. I don't know if all the women were not on there that day, but I was the presenter and I was the only woman. And then I was a bit shocked because I was thinking, okay, now they're young, and I know so many Fridays for Futures activists who are female, but then in this parliament it was male, and I was a bit confused. And I think that some of the topics that we have in these parliaments or in other institutions are not made for underrepresented groups, right? Even if for youth in rural areas, why would they go to Fridays for Future? It's not. It was not relevant when we talked to them. They will not start a Fridays for Future group. Their main concern was that they don't have enough perspective for the future. They don't have any things they can do. There is lots of impact from the church. Like they only have this kind of church activities going on in this area, so they have problems that in the city, for example, we don't discuss it. And the idea is that through working with them on topics that are more interesting for them, we can get them active. But yes, it's also like this, that in youth parliaments, but also the active people are really highly involved and they have a lot of knowledge. I mean, if you look at Fridays for Future, for example, all of the influencers on social media, they know so many things that when you talk to, let's say, basic informed people, they don't know what is the 1.5 degree goal, for example, and they will not. So that's why we need to shift more also to topics in schools. For example, digitalization in schools is a big topic that addresses everyone. So I think we need to find also more topics that addresses a broader mass than just like polarizing subjects that can be discussed in a panel discussion. You will see it now with the German election, people sitting in the panel talking for 6 hours. No young person who's just looking for a job or is completely impacted by Corona will look at a 6-hour discussion for the next candidate. So we need to reach them more closely in their topics. And also about Rookie as a platform, we try to be like overarching for everyone. We have lots of volunteers or people coming who say, hey, I want to get involved. It looks like here, you know, I don't have to you know, be too political. So we just need more starting points and more like positive politics, in the sense it's not only, you know, this, I mean, it will be so negative the next weeks for Germany. So we also need to make more constructive campaigns as well, like social media campaigns that are not just inside of these filters. But this is also a big problem, like you mentioned in the beginning, and I'm worried about this because really the algorithm will just show you what you want to hear. We can see that with right-wing people. If you talk to people who are right-wing and you look at the social media graphic, they will say what they saw in the social media graphics. You can see it one-on-one. So this is something scary, I think. So I hope that we can find ways to break that a little bit. Yeah.
I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, do we, Josie?
No more questions so far. We just had one more answer from Joachim regarding the when is transparency not helpful, and he added health. But yeah, so far from the chat.
Yeah, Roman, you have a question.
Yeah, well, personally, I'm interested in like offline citizen participation in deliberative mini publics, for example. And so we see an increasing use of like citizen panels, citizen assemblies, and so on. But now, because of the COVID situation, lots of these citizen panels had to move to the digital sphere, and so we see an increase in digital mini publics. But do you have research on these digital mini publics, and what does this research say? Do they work well? Do they function? Do they provide decent recommendations? Do they provide a deliberative quality in these digital mini publics? Or do you know anything about that?
Susana, did you want to say anything on that? Or?
No, you can go ahead. I mean, I took part in one round of citizen assemblies where I applied to take part, but then they didn't select me. So I only have it from personal experience that I was like, oh man, I would have. Maybe we can have also somewhere you can actively apply, and then because I went through I filled out all the forms, everything, but then they didn't select me. So I was like, okay, man. But yeah, I just said from my experience, but I didn't see any studies yet.
Yeah, so I've seen there have obviously during the pandemic, as you were saying, lots of these citizens' assemblies switched to online mode. And there have been some studies by the Nuffield Foundation in the UK I saw working on this. Off the top of my head, I'm not that familiar with the results of them. I mean, I think they went okay, which perhaps is a bit surprising. I mean, there's been a kind of, I guess, suspicion somewhat in the deliberative community about online participation. Although, I mean, right from the beginning, there's been experiments with kind of online deliberative forums, right? I mean, there's some, going back to the transparency question, there's some advantages to doing them online. One I remember particularly from the early 2000s was for women who had been abused by their partners. So it was to kind of inform decision making about domestic abuse. And for these people, it was really, really important that they could participate anonymously, right, in an online forum, because if it was found out that they were participating, they could have quite serious consequences from their partners. So there's certain things, there's certain kind of affordances of digital technology, I think, which can be really useful for including groups in deliberation, which weren't included previously. I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic experience, right, was a lot of these things actually started in presence and then switched to online. And this is actually quite different, I think. And this is what some of the research has shown compared to actually doing everything online. Because particularly for deliberation, I think those kind of social bonds, the kind of what happens in informal spaces outside of the actual formal deliberations is actually really important in kind of oiling the wheels of the deliberation, right? Like in building kind of relationships between people. And this is much harder to do online. And I also find this is similarly with the kind of academic conferences that I go to, which have all been online, right, and usually take place in person. I very much miss the actual informal stuff that happens, which is where you often have the more in-depth discussions and get the greater insights, and you also build your networks and so on. And I think this is also true of deliberative processes. So there are some things that you can do online that you can't do offline, but I think there are also some things that it's very hard to replicate online that it isn't that you can do offline. And I think this is when we're thinking about kind of collective decision-making processes online. I think this is actually a potential real problem, is that when you kind of are involved in like a collective decision-making or a collective action process online, you often kind of make this sort of quite individual contribution to a collective project, right? Like this is what the affordances of online allow. You can do it whenever you want. You can do it anonymously. You can take your time over it and so on. These are all good things, but it doesn't necessarily build the same kind of social capital as being in a room and being with people and having a conversation with them. And this would be my kind of concern if we move too much to kind of online forms of this kind of collective decision making. Is that essentially these forms of participation need those forms of social and collective capital, and if we only do it online, we kind of erode those bonds, and then there'll be kind of fatigue and people will stop doing it, because I think the social aspect is really important. So both Frank and Anna have their hands up, so maybe they also wanted to contribute on this. Frank?
Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, actually, I recently wrote my bachelor thesis about the Citizens' Assembly on Germany's role in the world, which also took part digitally. And I read some research on the comparison between face-to-face deliberation and online deliberation. They actually, there's not a lot of research on it, first of all. And what they said was it really depends on how they perform those and how they organize the deliberation process, because for this Citizens' Assembly, it was like basically the same thing, just in the online version, also with a Zoom room and in small groups and panel discussions and very inclusive format. And also they had technical support, which was one of the main problems in some studies I read, that the quality of the deliberation suffered from technical issues and difficulties, and some people couldn't join because their internet access was not as good as it should be. And so that was some of the struggles they had. And also, yeah, it definitely depends on how you structure the process and if you keep it inclusive. And they also had a technical support for people. And yeah, that's basically the same thing. So you can, I think you can do the same thing online. But as you said, Ricky, the problem with the group identification, and you only see people through the screen and you don't feel the connection between each other, maybe that's some issue that could be bad for the quality of the deliberation. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for the digital way, also because of you don't have to go there to the event, and you can stay at home and do it from there. And also the length of the event can be longer than just a weekend, so you can do it for like 3 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever. So yeah, that's what I read on the this topic, just to share with you guys.
Yeah, thanks, that was very helpful. Frank, did you still want to add something?
Maybe just one thing. I think it was excellent what you just said, Anna, but what I'm thinking is that I think the polarization that I think, Susana, you also mentioned that as I view it, it becomes sort of emphasized via social media. It's like the communication becomes a bit harsher, a bit more aggressive. And I'm curious, you know, what thoughts you have on using technology to turn that around, to, you know, to sort of move us in the other direction, to communication that is more based on kindness and love and relationship building. Can technology help create that change back to more human, kind communication? Mm-hmm.
Big question. I mean, obviously, anyone who wants to make a contribution to answering that question, feel free to raise your hand. I mean, for me, I think the problem with social media is the business model, and this is essentially what incentivizes the forms of communication that we see on these social media platforms. I'm kind of old enough to remember when Facebook first began, and it was a very different place to what it is now. And this was because it hadn't really developed. I mean, it didn't really have a business model at that point, right? Like, it didn't really know what it was doing. And it was only kind of later that it developed this kind of attention economy type business model, which is now the way all of these things work, which is that they want to kind of monopolize your attention in order to sell you advertising. Of course, it's not sort of written in the stars that this has to be the business model of social media. And so I think we can get a bit caught up in thinking that technology incentivizes us to communicate in this way, when I think it's actually the business model of social media that incentivizes us to communicate in this way. And if we find a different way of funding these kinds of technologies, then there's no reason that they have to produce these kind of unhealthy dynamics in deliberation. That would be my perspective, but other people may have different views.
So you mean that the state should fund Twitter, for example?
I mean, this is one option. I'm not sure if this is the right option, right? If I had that solution, I'd probably be a lot richer. But yeah, I mean, if we think about social media as a kind of public infrastructure, then it's kind of interesting that it is just at the moment solely organized through private companies. If we think about other forms of public infrastructure, they often go through these kinds of cycles of public and private ownership, right? Often when they're developing, so if you look at the way that the railways developed, for instance, they developed through a kind of wild west of private companies just building a bit of railway here and there to connect places that were profitable. And then it was decided that this was a kind of essential public infrastructure, and it was all nationalized. I'm talking about the UK experience here. I'm not so clear about how the railways developed in other countries. And yeah, so I don't know. I think we probably should think about social media as a public utility. I mean, it's obviously there are concerns about state ownership of this as well, given the kinds of power that would give to these state actors, particularly when we're seeing the rise of kind of far-right governments in a range of countries. Would I really want them to be able to kind of access all of my private social media posts? Probably not. So I don't know that state funding is a kind of easy answer. But there are other ways we can think about the business model. I mean, we could think about subscription fees, for instance, rather than funding through advertising revenue. I mean, this would also generate potentially a different communicative dynamic on the platform. Again, I don't know if that's the right model, but there's a whole range of different ways that we could finance communicative technologies so that they produce more healthy discussion.
So I think when it comes down to financing options to reach young people, especially through social media, wouldn't it be then an approach that programs, for example, like Vote Rookie, would be founded so that they can advertise their option in those social media platforms where the target group spends most of their time, I would say. Like, wouldn't that be like an approach?
I guess, Susana, that would be one for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was also just thinking, like, our colleagues in Nigeria always had, I don't know if it's still ongoing, but they had a Twitter ban for a long time now in Nigeria. So I also know a lot of people from other countries who are reaching LinkedIn via VPN connection. So I think we are speaking on a really good level, because we also have the access to these tools, right? So if you look at the countries where it gets banned or where you cannot raise your voice, it's like, I was just thinking of the other perspective and the implications. So for young people, social media, also during the SARS demonstrations in Nigeria last year, you could see the Twitter peak on the topic in October, for example, where they were communicating, and trying to raise and create awareness. But you need like better, I think this is a responsibility of the mainstream media, who are the ones who should provide more access to more facts, right? So they also spreading a lot of fake news, and I think that we need a better media setup as well, to inform people better, because right now, if you see the traditional media, what they're doing on social media, it's not that great. They're really behind. They're still focusing on a lot of print media. So I think we need also more established media houses in that to provide better information.
Josie, I think you maybe want to wrap us up.
Yes, exactly. So unfortunately, we have to come to an end because time already runs out. I want to thank everyone for participating and really creating this vibrant discussion. We will write down all your ideas and bring them to the conference on the future of Europe. I will put...
Oh, you've muted yourself.
Great. I will put a link in the chat right now. It's a Google document where 3 simple questions are asked regarding this webinar, but also once more about your wish for the future of Europe. It would be great if you could answer it. It would really help us. You don't have to do it right now, tomorrow, next days. It would really help us. And I also want to give a big thank you to our speakers, Ricky and Susana. It was a pleasure to have you here. It was really nice. Yeah, give some clapping hands. And to remind you all, you are really warmly welcome to come next week again. Our topic will be smart citizens, wise decisions, sustainability. It will be the same format, same day, same time. So I'm looking forward to see you all again. Of course, you can also put your contacts in the chat so you can network a little bit. I also saw that Ramon wants to, Roman, sorry, not Ramon. Roman wants to read Anna's bachelor thesis, which is really cool. Yeah, Susana already put her contact down. So feel free to network. And yeah, to wrap this up, it was really wonderful to discuss with you. Also in a smaller group, I think it was really, really good. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thanks, Josie, for the great organization.
Yes,
thanks
of course.
a lot.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much.
See you
That was
soon.
great. Thanks.